The camera glides through the cold, shadowy corridors of the imperial palace in Chang'an. The year is 654 AD. The only sounds are the rustle of silk and the muffled footsteps of serving maids. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by a piercing woman's scream filled with raw terror and grief. A close-up, a young woman's face contorted in agony. This is Wu Zetian, the favored concubine of Emperor Gaozong. The camera pulls back to reveal the source of her despair. Lying in lavish, gold-embroidered linens is the lifeless body of her newborn daughter. The air in the room grows thick, heavy with unspoken accusation. The childless Empress Wang has just left the chambers, and now her shadow seems to linger over the cradle. For the stunned court, the implication is clear. The jealous, barren first wife has eliminated the child of her fortunate rival. But for us, viewers from the future, this scene is not a tragedy, but a prologue. It is the starting point, the epicenter of an earthquake that will shatter a 1,000-year-old foundation. We are witnessing not just the death of an infant, but the birth of a monster, or a genius, depending on your perspective. This is the first, most bloody, and most brilliant move in a great chess game, where the prize is not just the emperor's favor, but the dragon throne itself, the symbol of heavenly power over the known world. This very moment poses the central, agonizing question of our entire story. How could a woman, designed to give life, use the death of her own child as a stepping stone to absolute power? Was this a monstrous slander, or a cold, unthinkable calculation, proving that on her path to the top, she was willing to sacrifice not only her enemies, but her own flesh and blood? The answer is hidden in the labyrinths of her soul and in the bloody annals of history that we will walk with her, from a powerless concubine to the bloody throne of the only female emperor in China's millennia-long history. To understand how such a gambit was possible, you must see the grand stage on which this drama unfolded. The Tang Empire in the mid-7th century is not just a state. It is a universe, the golden age of Chinese civilization. Its capital, Chang'an, is the largest and most cosmopolitan city on the planet, a magnet drawing merchants, monks, poets, and adventurers from all over the world. Along the Silk Road flow not just silk, porcelain, and spices, but new ideas. Buddhism from India, Nestorianism from Persia, Manichaeism from Central Asia. The empire seems to have reached the peak of harmony and prosperity, the living embodiment of the Confucian ideal of a perfectly ordered society. But this is just a facade, a gilded cage where everyone knows their place. At the core of this world lies an unshakable, granite-like patriarchal order. Society is a strict hierarchy, with the emperor, the son of heaven, at the top, and below him, his scholar officials, aristocrats, warriors, and peasants. And somewhere at the very bottom of this ladder is woman. Her fate, according to the teachings of Confucius, is the 3 obediences. In youth, to her father. In marriage, to her husband. In old age, to her son. Her world is limited by the walls of her home. Her highest purpose is to bear an heir. Her greatest virtue is submission. In this world, a woman cannot own property, take the civil service exams, or command an army. She is an object, not a subject, of history, a shadow, not a person. And it was into this polished, but suffocatingly tight world that a girl was born who was destined not just to break these rules, but to burn them to the ground. The Tang Empire, unaware, was nurturing a threat more terrible than any foreign enemy. A woman who dared to think like a man and desire what, by right, belonged only to men. This world, certain of its own permanence, did not yet know that its golden age would become the backdrop for the bloodiest and most incredible story of a rise to power. Wu Zetian, or Wu Zhao, as she was named at birth, did not belong to the cream of the aristocracy, to those ancient families who had surrounded the throne for centuries and considered power their exclusive right. Her father, Wu Shiyue, was a supporter of the Tang Dynasty's founder, Emperor Gaozu, and had received a high post as chancellor for his loyalty. He was, in other words, new money, a nouveau riche whose rise provoked a poorly concealed disdain from the old, hereditary nobility. To them, the Wu family were upstarts, lacking true noble blood. Wu Zetian felt this stigma of inferiority from her earliest childhood. She saw how people flattered her father to his face, but sneered behind his back. This became the first, and perhaps most important, lesson of her life. Social status is fragile and depends not on merit, but on birth. This humiliation, this second-class status in the eyes of the elite, did not break her. Instead, it ignited a cold, unquenchable fire in her soul, the fire of ambition. From an early age, her father, against all tradition, encouraged her thirst for knowledge. While other girls of her circle were taught embroidery and to play the zither, she studied classical texts, history, and politics. She read about the great rulers of the past, about strategy and tactics, about palace intrigues. She absorbed knowledge that was considered an exclusively male prerogative. This was her secret weapon, her way of compensating for her lack of noble birth. She understood a fundamental truth of power. Strength lies not only in the sword or in a pedigree, but in the mind, the ability to understand people, to manipulate their weaknesses and desires. Her origin, which should have been her curse, became her greatest stimulus. She had to prove to all those arrogant aristocrats that she, the daughter of an upstart, was worth more than all of them combined. This burning need for recognition, for revenge against the humiliation of her family, became the internal engine that would push her forward, through all obstacles, over the corpses of enemies and friends, to the very pinnacle of power, a height a woman in her position could not even dream of. Fate, or perhaps simple coincidence, that would later be interpreted as the will of heaven, added a mystical touch to her story. A disturbing prophecy had long circulated through the Tang Empire, recorded in ancient books of divination. After the Tang has ruled for 3 generations, a warrior prince, Wu Wang, will rise and become master of all under heaven. This prophecy was a thorn in the side of Emperor Taizong, the second and one of the dynasty's greatest rulers. A pragmatic man, but superstitious nonetheless, he could not ignore such a direct threat to his Li clan. The word Wu, meaning martial or warlike, became a curse to him. By his order, a veritable witch hunt began. He searched among his courtiers and military leaders for anyone whose name, title, or nickname contained the fateful character. Several high-ranking officials and generals were executed or removed from power on the slightest suspicion. The emperor was certain he had pulled the weed out by the root, preventing the coming catastrophe. The irony of fate was that he had not just overlooked the main threat, he had just invited that very threat into his own home. At the age of 14, the young Wu Zhao arrived at the palace as a junior concubine of the 5th rank. Her family name, Wu, used the same character from the prophecy. But who could imagine that the warrior prince, the mighty usurper, would turn out to be a fragile teenage girl, one of hundreds of faceless beauties in the vast imperial harem? Taizong probably never even learned her name. He saw in her only a Kairan, a talented person, whose duty was to entertain the Son of Heaven. This omen, ignored by the most powerful man in the empire, created an aura of predestination around Wu Zetian. It was as if fate itself was guiding her, hiding beneath a mask of feminine submission, the steel will of a future warrior who would one day indeed seize power and become master of all under heaven. The years spent in Emperor Taizong's harem were not a time of luxury and pleasure for Wu Zetian, but a harsh school of survival, the true forge of her character. Entering the palace as a hopeful 14-year-old girl, she quickly faced a brutal reality. Emperor Taizong was a mature, battle-hardened warrior and an experienced ruler. He was interested in neither her sharp mind nor her defiant character. She once boasted that she could tame his wildest horse, but would need 3 things: an iron whip, an iron mace, and a dagger. If the horse disobeyed the whip, she would strike its head with the mace, and if that failed, she would cut its throat. This story, which she herself told many years later, shocked the emperor with its cruelty. He saw in her not feminine softness, but a terrifying ruthlessness, and from then on, he kept her at a distance. She never earned a place in his bed, remaining in the humiliating status of a low-rank concubine. For any other girl, this would have been the end of all dreams, a slow fading away in a gilded cage. But for Wu Zetian, this obscurity became her university. Deprived of the chance to fight for the emperor's attention, she turned all her energy to self-education. She spent days and nights in the palace library, greedily devouring works on history, philosophy, strategy, and the art of governance. She perfected her calligraphy, bringing it to the level of recognized masters, and studied the biographies of great emperors, analyzing their successes and failures. This was not just entertainment to cure boredom. It was focused preparation for the future. She watched other concubines weave petty intrigues, fighting over new dresses and jewels, and understood the futility of their efforts. She, meanwhile, was accumulating the greatest treasure: knowledge. These 12 years of humiliating waiting and intense intellectual work forged her character, transforming a naive girl into a cold-blooded strategist. She learned patience, the ability to hide her true thoughts behind an impenetrable mask, and she learned the primary lesson of palace life. True power is not in beauty, which fades, but in the intellect, which only sharpens with time. It was in this atmosphere of humiliation and oblivion, in the shadow of the aging Emperor Taizong, that Wu Zetian made her first, truly risky and fateful move. It was not a political intrigue or a military conspiracy, but something far more dangerous and personal: a forbidden love. Her object was the heir to the throne, Prince Li Ji, the son of her master, Emperor Taizong. By all laws and traditions, as her father's concubine, she was absolutely untouchable to the son. A liaison with her would be tantamount to incest and punishable by death for them both. But Wu Zetian saw in the young, soft-hearted, and impressionable prince not just a man, but her only chance for salvation. Li Ji often visited his ailing father, and during these visits, his path crossed with that of the forgotten concubine. What exactly he saw in her, her beauty, her precocious mind, or perhaps the hidden strength he himself lacked, we can only guess. A secret romance began between them, consisting of stolen glances, fleeting touches in the palace corridors, and perhaps secret meetings. For Li Ji, it was likely genuine passion, the sweetness of forbidden fruit. But for Wu Zetian, it was a desperate, calculated gamble. She understood perfectly that after Taizong's death, all his childless concubines faced a grim fate: lifelong confinement in a Buddhist monastery. It was a slow, agonizing death in obscurity. The affair with the heir to the throne was her only lifeline, the only thread she could grasp to avoid being cast into oblivion. This was her first act of defiance against the system, her first violation of a sacred taboo. She staked everything, including her own life, on the ghostly hope for a future. This forbidden love became her symbolic first blood, the first step on a ladder where every rung would be built on the violation of another law, be it the law of man, God, or nature. Behind every great ambition, there is often a deep wound, a personal demon that pushes a person to unimaginable acts. For Wu Zetian, this demon was a panic-stricken fear of oblivion, born from bitter humiliation. In 649, Emperor Taizong died. For the empire, it was the end of a great era. For Wu Zetian, it was the beginning of a personal hell. As custom dictated, all of the late emperor's childless concubines, including her, were forcibly tonsured as nuns and sent to the Ganye monastery. This was not a place of spiritual peace. It was a prison for women whose sole function, to please the emperor, had become obsolete. From the luxury of the palace, she was thrown into a world of cold stone walls, coarse robes, meager food, and endless monotonous prayers. Her name was erased, her identity nullified. She became one of hundreds of shaved-headed women, doomed to spend the rest of their days mourning a master who had barely noticed her in life. It was there, in the silence and despair of the monastery cell, that her character was finally tempered. Bitterness and resentment mingled with an icy rage. She watched other women resign themselves to their fate, finding solace in religion, but she could not surrender. For her, it was tantamount to death. Her entire intellect, all her knowledge, her entire will to live, rebelled against this injustice. She vowed that if she ever got the chance to escape this living tomb, she would use it. She would return. But she would return not to be a beautiful toy in the hands of men, dependent on their mercy. She would return to become the master of her own destiny. This experience burned all sentimentality from her soul. She understood that in the world of power, there is no room for weakness, compassion, or morality. There is only the goal and the means. Her secret motivation from then on was simple and terrifying. She would never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to decide for her whether she lived or died. She herself would become the force that determines fates. The monastery, meant to be her grave, instead became her cocoon, from which a future ruthless ruler, not a submissive nun, would emerge. The chance she had so desperately hoped for came from a most unexpected quarter. The new emperor, Gaozong, the same Li Ji, her secret lover, had not forgotten her. One day, on the anniversary of his father's death, he visited the Ganye monastery to burn incense. There, he saw Wu Zetian again. Legend says their eyes met, and old feelings flared up with new force. But behind this romantic story lay a cold political calculation. At that time, Emperor Gaozong's court was consumed by a bitter struggle between his wife, the childless Empress Wang, and his favorite concubine, Xiao, who had already borne him a son. Empress Wang, seeing her influence over her husband waning, decided to play a risky card. She knew of the emperor's old affection for the nun Wu and decided to bring her back to the palace, to use her as a weapon against concubine Xiao. She reasoned like a typical palace intriguer. Wu Zetian, owing her salvation, would be a loyal pawn and would divert the emperor's attention from her hated rival. This was her fatal mistake. She had released a tiger from its cage, naively believing she could keep it on a leash. In 651, Wu Zetian returned to the Forbidden City in triumph, but this was not the timid girl who had left it years before. She returned as a seasoned strategist with a clear plan of action. She quickly won back the emperor's love, but she didn't stop there. she began to methodically build her own power base. She was charming to the servants, generous to the eunuchs, and attentive to the officials who came to report to the emperor. She was building a network of loyalists, her eyes and ears, in every corner of the palace. Empress Wang realized with horror that the weapon she had created had taken on a will of its own and was now aimed directly at her. Wu Zetian was no longer a pawn. She was becoming a player, slowly but surely arranging the pieces on the board for the decisive game. While the men of the Tang Dynasty were busy with what was considered the real business of rulers, expanding the empire's borders, Wu Zetian was waging her own, equally important war in the very heart of power. Emperor Gaozong, who had inherited a vast and mighty state from his father, continued his policy of conquest. Chinese armies fought grueling campaigns on the Korean peninsula against the states of Goguryeo and Baekje. They repelled raids by Turkic tribes in the north and strengthened their control over territories in Central Asia. These military successes brought glory and new lands, but they also diverted the attention of the emperor and his court from the tectonic shifts happening in his own chambers. Gaozong, unlike his father, did not possess iron health. He suffered from severe headaches and dizziness, which grew more frequent over time. His illness made him weak and increasingly dependent on those around him. And the closest, most trusted person by his side was Wu Zetian. She did not just share his bed, she became his closest advisor. When the emperor was too ill to attend to state affairs, it was she who read him the minister's reports and helped him make decisions. Gradually, her influence spread beyond the bedroom and into the throne hall. Officials quickly learned that the path to the emperor's ear lay through his favorite concubine. Appointments to important posts, the passing of laws, the announcement of amnesties. More and more often, the invisible but firm hand of Wu Zetian was behind these decisions. She was becoming a gray cardinal, a shadow ruler, whose power was not yet formal, but was already absolute. The geopolitical landscape was changing not just on the distant borders, but in the very heart of the empire, where a woman, who by law was forbidden from even attending official audiences, was beginning to effectively rule the vast country. The old aristocracy watched with alarm as this upstart concentrated more and more power in her hands, and they understood that their own influence was melting away with each passing day. The culmination of the first stage of her ascent, and her tactical masterpiece, was the story of her newborn daughter's death in 654. This event, shrouded in dark mystery, became the battering ram that breached the impenetrable wall of palace traditions. The historical chronicles, written much later by her detractors, paint a chilling picture. According to this version, Wu Zetian, after giving birth to a daughter, waited for a visit from Empress Wang, who came to congratulate her and held the infant in a motherly fashion. As soon as the empress left, Wu Zetian allegedly smothered the child herself, covered her with a blanket, and when Emperor Gaozong returned, she staged a scene of inconsolable grief, subtly hinting that the only visitor had been the childless and envious empress. The shocked and enraged emperor, already charmed by Wu and dissatisfied with his wife, believed this version without question. Truth or monstrous slander, we will never know. No direct evidence of her guilt exists, and the version of her involvement was recorded by historians who sought to tarnish her memory. But from the standpoint of political strategy, the move was flawless. It hit its target precisely, exploiting all the system's pressure points. First, it appealed to the emotions of the weak-willed emperor, turning a political conflict into a personal tragedy. Second, it painted Empress Wang, the symbol of virtue and order, as a monster capable of infanticide, undermining the very foundation of her legitimacy. Third, It cast Zetian not as an ambitious intriguer, but as a grieving victim, a mother who had lost her child, which aroused sympathy and support. Regardless of whether she was actually guilty, she used this death with maximum efficiency. This was her transition from petty intrigues to the high-stakes game. She demonstrated that she was ready to use the most sacred and tragic aspects of human life as pieces on a chessboard, and that in her arsenal of manipulation, there were no forbidden moves. In this deadly game for power, Zetian had one main, irreplaceable, though not always self-aware ally, Emperor Gaozong himself. His love, bordering on obsession, and his failing health were the foundation upon which she built her power. He was her shield and her sword. Her enemies, however, were the entire old guard, the bastion of Confucian order and aristocratic tradition. These were the powerful chancellors, comrades in arms of his father, Taizong, who were accustomed to seeing themselves as the true guardians of the empire. Chief among them was the emperor's maternal uncle, Jiangsun Wuji, the most influential and respected man in the state. Along with other pillars of the regime, like Chu Suiliang, they saw in Zetian not just an ambitious concubine, but a mortal threat to the entire system. She was a woman of low birth, by their standards, who dared to meddle in state affairs. She had been the concubine of the late emperor, and her elevation by the current ruler was a violation of all norms of filial piety. They saw in her a witch who had bewitched their sovereign, a fox spirit from folk tales that destroys dynasties. When Gaozong, incited by Zetian, first spoke of deposing Empress Wang and raising Wu in her place, these chancellors stood like a wall. At an audience, Chu Suiliang demonstratively slammed his official tablet on the throne steps, declaring he would rather return to his village than witness such a sacrilege. This was open confrontation, a battle between the old order and a new, unknown force. Zetian understood that as long as these men were in power, her position would always be precarious. Therefore, her next goal was not just to take the empress's throne, but to destroy those who stood in her way. She began to whisper to Gaozong that the chancellors did not respect his will, that they saw him only as the shadow of his great father, and were trying to rule behind his back. She skillfully played on his insecurities, turning his loyal but defiant advisors into his personal enemies. The battle for the empress's throne became a battle for the future of China. After long hesitation, under the relentless pressure of Zetian, Emperor Gaozong made a fateful decision in 655. He officially deposed Empress Wang and her ally, Concubine Xiao, and proclaimed Wu as the new empress. For her, this was a triumph, the pinnacle of her dreams. But she knew the victory would not be complete as long as her enemies lived. The deposed empress and concubine were imprisoned in a remote palace. Legend holds that one day, the emperor, tormented by remorse, secretly visited them. Seeing their pitiful state, he took pity and promised to release them soon. But Zetian had spies everywhere. When she learned of this visit, she flew into a rage. She understood that the slightest weakness from her husband could cost her everything. As long as these women were alive, they remained a symbol of the old order, a rallying point for all her enemies. And so, she made a decision that forever cemented her reputation as a ruthless monster. She ordered a horrific execution, known as the human swine, to be carried out on the former empress and concubine. They cut off her hands and feet, gouged out her eyes, and threw her mutilated, but still living, body into a large vat of wine. Dying in terrible agony, Empress Wang is said to have cursed Wu, wishing that in her next life, Wu would be born a mouse and she a cat, so she could hunt her for eternity. This act of extreme cruelty was not just revenge. It was a political manifesto, a message to all her opponents. She was demonstrating that she would stop at nothing, that her vengeance would be terrible and inescapable. She was burning out any possibility of restoration, any hope for her enemies. This was the point of no return. She had consciously chosen the path of fear, understanding that in a world where a woman could not be respected as a ruler, she would be feared as a tyrant. And that fear would become the most reliable foundation of her power. Her enthronement as empress opened a new chapter in Wu Zetian's ascent. Now her power was not shadowy, but official. Emperor Gaozong's illness progressed, and he withdrew more and more from affairs, handing the reins of government to his energetic and intelligent wife. From this moment, a unique political situation emerged in China, which historians call the era of the two sacred rulers, Ersheng. Formally, the emperor sat on the throne, but in reality, the country was ruled by a tandem. At official audiences, Wu Zetian sat behind a silk screen behind Gaozong's throne. Ministers would address the emperor, but often the reply, the decision, or the edict would come from behind the screen, in her voice. This was an unprecedented violation of all Confucian norms, according to which a woman had no right to even be present during matters of state. But her intellect, her deep knowledge of the classics, and her iron will were so evident that even her most ardent opponents were forced to admit her competence. She was not just ruling, she was ruling effectively. Under her leadership, work on the legal code continued. She encouraged agriculture and reformed the army and the administrative apparatus. She began to promote talented men of humble origins to high posts, creating a new elite loyal to her personally, thereby weakening the position of the old aristocracy. This was the peak of her power as empress. She had achieved what no woman before her could have dreamed of. She was the co-ruler of the greatest empire on earth. This was the moment of her greatest hubris. She had challenged not only tradition, but heaven itself, proving that a woman could rule as well as, or even better than, a man. But as so often happens, it was at the moment of supreme triumph that the first, barely perceptible cracks began to appear in the foundation of her power, foreshadowing the coming storm. Despite the outward omnipotence of the ruling tandem, internal tensions were mounting. Emperor Gaozong himself, who had been her chief tool and support for so long, began to realize how dependent he had become. He was frightened by her dominance, her total control over the court and government. He saw that she had transformed from a loving wife into his jailer. The final straw came in 664. Empress Wu, without informing him, invited a Taoist magician to the palace to perform certain mysterious rituals, which her enemies interpreted as witchcraft, intended to finally subdue the emperor's will or even hasten his death. When Gaozong found out, he was furious. He secretly summoned the chancellor Shangguan Yi and, in a fit of desperation, ordered him to draft an edict deposing Empress Wu. The chancellor, who had long hated her, gladly complied. The edict was written, and Wu Zetian's fate seemed to hang by a thread. But, as we know, her spy network was flawless. One of her loyal servants immediately reported what was happening. At the very moment the emperor held the finished edict, Wu Zetian burst into his chambers. She did not scream or beg. She looked at her husband calmly and coldly and asked him just one question. "What have I done to deserve this?" Faced with her icy calm and the irrefutable logic with which she listed all her services to the empire, the weak emperor faltered. He feared her anger, feared the consequences. He snatched the edict from the chancellor's hands, tore it up, and cowardly blamed Shangguan Yi for everything. This episode was a turning point. Wu Zetian not only survived, but emerged from the conflict even stronger. She realized she could no longer rely on even her husband's love, and Gaozong realized he was no longer master in his own palace. Soon, Chancellor Shangguan Yi was accused of conspiracy and executed along with his entire family. It was a demonstration of force. From now on, anyone who dared to oppose her would be destroyed, and not even the emperor could protect them. The last barrier on Wu Zetian's path to absolute, sole power collapsed at the end of 683. Emperor Gaozong, whose health had been steadily declining for years, finally died. His death, though expected, was the fatal act that definitively changed the balance of power. While he was alive, Wu Zetian, despite all her real power, formally remained just his wife, the Empress consort. Her legitimacy flowed from him. With his death, the screen she had ruled from behind was finally gone. Now, she stepped into the spotlight. By law, the throne was inherited by her eldest son, Li Xian, who took the throne name Zhongzong. As the new emperor's mother, Wu Zetian received the title of Empress Dowager and Regent. But this was no longer enough for her. The role of regent implied temporary power, until her son was old enough to rule independently. But Wu Zetian had no intention of yielding the throne she considered hers by right of conquest. She had fought too long and too hard to reach this pinnacle, only to hand it over to her young, ambitious, and, most importantly, not fully controllable son. Gaozong's death was her moment of truth. There was no more need to hide behind a screen, no more need to play the role of the loving wife and loyal assistant. She could, at last, rule openly. Her husband's death was not a tragedy for her. It was a liberation. She dressed in mourning, but beneath the grieving robes beat a heart full of triumph and anticipation. Now, only her own son stood between her and her ultimate goal, to become not just a ruler, but the founder of her own dynasty. And as the near future would show, motherly feelings were no obstacle for her. The new emperor, Zhongzong, did not prove to be such a pliable puppet. He was young, hot-headed, and determined to rule independently, to escape his mother's all-encompassing control. He began promoting relatives of his wife, Empress Wei, to high posts, trying to build his own support at court and weaken the clique loyal to Wu Zetian. His greatest mistake was a careless statement made in a fit of anger. When one of his ministers dared to object to the appointment of the emperor's father-in-law to a high post, Zhongzong impetuously exclaimed, "I could give the entire empire to my father-in-law. What could you do about it?" These words were immediately reported to the Empress Dowager. For Wu Zetian, this was the perfect pretext for decisive action. She saw this not as youthful bravado, but as a direct threat to her power. She could not allow a new, uncontrollable faction to form around the throne. Her reaction was swift and merciless. Just 6 weeks after his accession, Wu Zetian, using her authority as regent, convened the high ministers and, after reading them her son's traitorous words, announced his deposition. Soldiers burst into the throne room, tore the imperial regalia from the young emperor, and led him away. He was deposed, stripped of all titles, and sent into exile in a remote province. In his place, she installed her younger, more compliant and timid son, Li Dan, under the throne name Ruizong. But he was an emperor in name only. He was forbidden from participating in government, lived under virtual house arrest in his quarters, and was not even allowed to receive visitors. All power now officially passed into the hands of Wu Zetian as regent for a puppet emperor. This act demonstrated a new reality to all of China. Her will was above tradition, above blood ties. For her, power was an absolute value, for which she was willing to sacrifice even her own children. The political struggle had given way to an internal family drama, where a mother had become the chief enemy of her sons. Having secured herself from the immediate threat of her sons, Zetian began the next phase of consolidating her power, a total cleansing of the political field. She understood that her position as a usurper, a woman ruling against all laws, was extremely vulnerable. Her main threat remained the powerful Li clan, the imperial family of the Tang Dynasty, and the old aristocracy that supported them. To break their resistance, she unleashed a campaign of state terror unrivaled in Chinese history. The centerpiece of this campaign was the creation of a secret police. Her agents, ruthless men personally loyal to her, such as Lai Junchen and Zhou Xing, flooded the capital and the provinces. A whole system for encouraging denunciations was created. At the palace gates, 4 bronze urns of different colors were installed, where anyone could anonymously drop a report. One for conspiracies, one for criticisms of the authorities, one for suggestions on governance, and one for complaints of injustice. In practice, this turned into a monstrous tool of repression. Anyone could slander their neighbor, debtor, or rival, accusing them of disloyalty. The accused were seized by the secret police and subjected to sophisticated torture, extracting confessions to non-existent plots. Under torture, people implicated dozens or hundreds of others, and the machine of repression spun up with terrifying speed. The atmosphere in the empire became suffocating with fear and suspicion. No one could feel safe. Officials going to court for service in the morning would say goodbye to their families, not knowing if they would return home that evening. This period became known as the Reign of Terror. But for Zetian, this was not senseless cruelty. It was a cold, efficient tool she used to systematically destroy all opposition, pulling up the very roots of any potential resistance to her rule. She was ruling not by love or respect, but by primal, pervasive fear. The main target of her terror was the imperial Li clan, the bearers of the sacred blood of the Tang Dynasty. Zetian understood that as long as a single prince of this line lived, one who held a legitimate claim to the throne, her own power would remain illegitimate. Therefore, she began a methodical, systematic, and ruthless campaign for the physical extermination of her late husband's relatives. One by one, members of the Li clan fell victim to fabricated charges of treason. Dozens of princes, their sons, and their grandsons were arrested based on denunciations, tortured, and executed. Others were forced to commit suicide to avoid a public trial. This was a bloody purge, comparable in scale to those of the most brutal tyrants in world history. She spared no one. Even her own daughter-in-law, the wife of her exiled son Zhongzong, was starved to death in prison. Princesses were married off to commoners or exiled to remote regions. The goal was clear: to cut down the mighty tree of the Tang Dynasty to plant the seeds of her own. This cruelty inspired horror and hatred, but it also paralyzed the will to resist. The aristocracy saw that even imperial blood was no protection from this woman's wrath. In 688, a group of Li princes, realizing they all faced certain death, rose in rebellion. But it was poorly organized and quickly crushed by troops loyal to Zetian. The failure of this rebellion gave her the perfect pretext for a new, even larger wave of repressions. Now, anyone with the surname Li was automatically a suspect. She wasn't just eliminating competitors, she was erasing the memory of the dynasty she intended to replace. It was a long and bloody process, but by the end of the decade, her goal was nearly achieved. The Li clan was decapitated, terrified, and practically destroyed as a political force. In parallel with the physical destruction of her enemies, Zetian waged an equally important ideological war. She understood that strength and fear alone were not enough to establish lasting power. She needed a new ideology that would justify her rule in the eyes of the people and the bureaucracy. The main obstacle was Confucianism, which had been China's state ideology for centuries and simply had no place for a female ruler. Therefore, Zetian bet on another great religion, Buddhism. Unlike the strictly hierarchical and patriarchal Confucianism, Buddhism was more flexible and contained images of strong female deities like the Bodhisattva Guanyin. Zetian began to generously endow Buddhist monasteries, finance the construction of temples and pagodas, and draw influential monks into her inner circle. She declared Buddhism the state religion, placing it above Taoism, which had traditionally been favored by the Li imperial clan. The culmination of this campaign was the miraculous discovery of an ancient Buddhist text called the Great Cloud Sutra. In it was a prophecy that a Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, would soon come to the world and would appear in the form of a female ruler who would bring an era of peace and prosperity. Court monks, generously paid by Zetian, wrote commentaries on the sutra that directly identified the Dowager Empress as this incarnation. Copies of the sutra were distributed throughout the empire and read aloud in monasteries. In this way, she was creating a divine sanction for herself, placing her power above human laws and traditions. She was not just a regent, she was a messiah, whose rule was foreordained by heaven itself. It was a brilliant move that allowed her to bypass Confucian prohibitions and create a new, sacred legitimacy for her future, even more audacious step. To emphasize the unique and unprecedented nature of her era, Zetian took a step that demonstrated her boundless ambition. She began to reform the Chinese language itself. By her order, a group of scholars developed 12 to 30 new characters to replace some of the old ones. The most famous of these was the new character for her own name. She abandoned the name Zhao, given to her at birth, and adopted a new one created especially for her. This new character, Zhao, was incredibly symbolic. It consisted of two parts, sun, Ri, and moon, Yue, hovering over an empty sky, Kong. The meaning was clear. She was the sole luminary, encompassing both the masculine, sun, yang, and feminine, moon, yin, principles, illuminating the universe. She was not just a man or a woman. She was something greater, a cosmic phenomenon uniting both principles. This character became mandatory in all official documents. Any incorrect writing of it was considered a crime. This was not just a tyrant's whim. It was a deeply calculated act of symbolic politics. By rewriting the language, she was rewriting reality. She was showing that her rule was not merely a continuation of the Tang Dynasty, but the beginning of a completely new era, so unique that it required new words to describe it. This linguistic experiment, along with other symbolic gestures, like establishing new court rituals and changing the calendar, was part of a grand plan to prepare the public consciousness for the final, most unthinkable step. She was methodically, step by step, destroying all the symbols of the old world and erecting her own in their place. She wanted the very idea that a woman could not be the son of heaven to become archaic and absurd in the new world she was building. By 690, the stage was fully set for the final act. All opposition had been physically destroyed or morally crushed. The new ideology, declaring her a divine incarnation, had been embedded in the public consciousness. The symbolic universe had been rebuilt around her. All that remained was the final step. But even for a figure as powerful as Zetian, a direct seizure of the throne was too risky. She needed to arrange it to look as if she were not acting of her own free will, but yielding to the insistent requests of the people. A grand political performance was staged. From all corners of the empire, petitions began to flow into the capital, signed by tens of thousands of people, officials, monks, commoners, all containing the same plea. The Empress Dowager must accept the title of emperor and found a new dynasty. Of course, all these popular initiatives were carefully orchestrated by her supporters. Wu Zetian, following ritual, feigned refusal several times, declaring her modesty and her reluctance to break tradition. But the stream of petitions did not dry up. Her nephew, Wu Chengxi, even accidentally found a white stone in the Luo River, allegedly bearing the inscription, "A wise mother ruler will come, and her reign will bring eternal prosperity." The stone was solemnly delivered to the palace as another sign of heaven's will. Finally, yielding to the will of the people and the gods, in the autumn of 690, Wu Zetian did the unthinkable. She accepted the title of Huangdi, the sacred title that, for millennia, had only been held by men. She deposed her puppet son, Ruizong, giving him her own surname, Wu. She proclaimed the end of the Tang Dynasty and the founding of her own, the Zhou Dynasty. She became the first and only fully fledged female emperor in Chinese history. Concubine, nun, regent, all these roles were in the past. Now, she was the son of heaven. As the full-fledged emperor, Wu Zetian ruled for another 15 years, and this period, despite the brutality of her rise, cannot be called a time of decline. She proved to be a surprisingly effective and pragmatic ruler. Her first act was to move the capital from Chang'an, the stronghold of the old Tang aristocracy, to Luoyang, which she renamed the Divine Capital, Shendu. This was a symbolic break with the past. She understood that her power could not rest on the old aristocratic clans who would never forgive her usurpation. Therefore, she continued her policy of promoting men from the lower classes. She greatly expanded the civil service examination system, making it the primary channel for recruiting officials. Now, any talented young man, regardless of his origin, could build a career by passing exams on classical literature and philosophy. This allowed her to create a new class of administrators, loyal to her personally and to her dynasty. She was strict on corruption and incompetence, mercilessly executing officials who stole, but she also generously rewarded those who served her faithfully. In foreign policy, her reign was also quite successful. She appointed talented generals who managed to win back 4 strategic garrisons in Central Asia from the Tibetan Empire and, overall, maintained stability on the borders. She encouraged agriculture and trade. Paradoxically, the woman who came to power through terror and blood gave China a decade and a half of relative stability and prosperity. This proves that her ambition was not just a lust for power for its own sake. She genuinely believed she could rule better than the men of the Li clan, and in many ways, she succeeded. She was a brutal politician, but a competent administrator, which makes her figure even more complex and ambiguous. However, even at the pinnacle of absolute power, Wu Zetian remained human, and as the years passed, the shadows of the past and the burden of age began to weigh on her. Having taken the throne at the age of 67, she ruled into her twilight years. Her energy and iron will gradually give way to fatigue and suspicion. Her court began to look less like an efficient administrative center and more like a place ruled by favorites and schemers. In the last years of her life, 2 young brothers, Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong, gained enormous influence. Handsome, elegant, and completely unprincipled, they became her latest attachment, her lovers, and her closest advisors. The aging empress showered them with honors, titles, and wealth, allowing them to meddle in state affairs. The Zhang brothers behaved with arrogance and insolence, insulting high officials and using their position for personal enrichment. This aroused universal hatred at court. The officials and princes, who had tolerated Wu Zetian's rule because of her intellect and strength, were unwilling to submit to her capricious and talentless favorites. A dull resentment grew. Her own family, the nephews from the Wu clan whom she had elevated, began a fierce struggle with the surviving members of the Li clan for the right of succession. Wu Zetian hesitated, torn between passing the throne to her nephews, who would continue her Zhou dynasty, or to her sons, which would mean a restoration of the Tang. This indecision, coupled with the growing influence of the Zhang brothers, created a sense of a power vacuum. The total control she had held for decades began to weaken. The shadows on the throne were gathering, heralding the swift and inevitable end of her astonishing era. The end came in the beginning of 705. The 80-year-old Wu Zetian was gravely ill and barely left her chambers. Her grip had weakened completely. For her opponents, this was the signal to act. A group of high-ranking officials, including the Chancellor Zhang Jianzhi, who had secretly remained loyal to the Tang Dynasty, formed a conspiracy. They understood that if Wu Zetian died, power would likely be seized by the hated Zhang brothers, plunging the empire into chaos. The only solution was the restoration of the legitimate Li dynasty. The conspirators secured the support of the palace guard commanders and the heir apparent, Li Xian, the same Zhongzong whom she had once deposed, then brought back from exile and made her heir. One night in February, the conspirators launched a coup. They burst into the palace, killed the Zhang brothers outside the Empress's quarters, and surrounded her bedchamber. Legend says that upon hearing the commotion, the sick and frail Wu Zetian rose from her bed and demanded to know who dared to rebel. When told it was conspirators who had come to execute the traitorous Zhangs, she calmly said, "Since they are already dead, you may return to your quarters." But it was too late. The conspirators entered her room and, showing formal respect, forcefully asked her to abdicate in favor of her son, Crown Prince Li Xian. Wu Zetian looked at the faces of the men who just yesterday had trembled in fear at her name and understood the game was over. Her time was up. She had neither the strength nor the loyalists to resist. That same day, she signed the abdication edict. Her 15-year reign as emperor of the Zhou dynasty was over. The great era of the female emperor had ended just as it began, with a palace coup. The end of Wu Zetian's life was full of bitter irony. The woman who had spent decades destroying the Tang dynasty to found her own, the Zhou, was ultimately forced by her own abdication edict to restore the Tang. Her son, Li Xian, ascended the throne again as Emperor Zhongzong. His first act was to restore his dynasty's rightful name. The great Zhou dynasty, Wu Zetian's life's dream, had lasted only 15 years and vanished with its founder, remaining only a bizarre and bloody interlude in the 300-year history of the Tang. After her abdication, Wu Zetian was moved to another palace and given the honorable but completely empty title, Grand and Merciful Empress Zetian, the Revolutionary. Her former enemies and former subjects now paid her visits, formally to show respect, but in reality, to ensure she was no longer a threat. For the woman who had held the fates of millions in her hands for half a century, this was the final and most terrible humiliation. She was once again in a gilded cage, just as in her distant youth. History had come full circle. She began her journey as a concubine to an emperor of the Li clan, and ended it as the honored prisoner of an emperor of the Li clan. Her titanic struggle, all the intrigues, all the blood she had shed, ultimately led back to where it all began. Perhaps in her final days, gazing from her window at a world that once again belonged to the men of the Tang, she reflected on this irony. She had been able to change her own life, but she could not change the course of history. She had managed to break every rule, but after her, the system restored itself as if nothing had ever happened. Zetian died at the end of that same year, 705, just months after her overthrow. She passed away at the age of 81, having outlived most of her enemies, her friends, and even her own children. Before her death, she left a will that became her final and greatest mystery. She asked to be buried, not as the emperor-founder of the Zhou dynasty, but as the empress consort of her husband, Gaozong, in their shared tomb. And most importantly, she ordered that her funeral stele, the massive stone monument erected on every emperor's grave, inscribed with their main virtues and achievements, be left empty. This order was carried out. To this day, next to the Qianling Mausoleum, where Gaozong and Wu Zetian rest, stands a huge, perfectly polished stone slab without a single character. What does this blank stele mean? Historians have debated it for over 1,000 years. Some believe it was a late admission of guilt, a silent acknowledgement that her deeds were so monstrous they did not deserve mention. Others see it as an act of unheard-of pride. She considered her achievements so great that they could not be described in words, and left it to heaven itself to judge her. A third group offers the most profound interpretation. It was her final, brilliant move, addressed to posterity. She knew the victors write the history, and that the Confucian historians, restored to power, would do everything to blacken her memory. By leaving the stele blank, she was, in effect, saying, "I do not trust you to write my story. I leave it open. Judge me for yourselves." This blank stele is not just a stone. It is an eternal question, hurled into the face of the ages. It is a symbol of the multifaceted and ambiguous nature of her personality, one that cannot be confined to simple praise or blame. It is her last word in her argument with history, a word that was never spoken. Wu Zetian's legacy is as contradictory as her life. Immediately after her death and the restoration of the Tang, Confucian historians began to create her black legend. In the official chronicles, she appears as the embodiment of all deadly sins, a cruel usurper, a licentious woman, a cunning and treacherous intriguer who killed her own children for power. This image dominated Chinese historiography for over 1,000 years. For generations of Chinese, her name was synonymous with tyranny and moral decay. She became a convenient bogeyman, an example of what happens when the natural order of things is violated and a woman takes power. In the 20th century, however, with the fall of the empire and the rise of new ideas, her figure was reassessed. Communist leader Mao Zedong spoke of her with respect, seeing her as a strong and effective ruler who fought against the old aristocracy. Western and Chinese feminists saw in her an icon, a woman who, in a brutal patriarchal world, managed to fight her way to the very top and prove that a woman was capable of ruling a state. Modern historians try to avoid extremes. They acknowledge her monstrous cruelty, her terror, and her ruthlessness. But at the same time, they note her undeniable political talent, her administrative abilities, and the fact that during her reign, China did not collapse, but continued to develop. She remains one of the most complex and controversial figures in world history. Was she a monster? By modern standards, certainly. Was she a genius? Undoubtedly. Her story is a mirror in which every era looks and sees a reflection of its own fears, prejudices, and ideals regarding women and power. And here we finally arrive at the solution to the central paradox embedded in the very title of our story. How could a concubine, whose social role was reduced to submission and childbearing, become the emperor, committing along the way the most anti-maternal act, the murder of her own child? The answer is that she used the very tools of the patriarchal world to destroy it from within. In a world where a woman's only capital was her beauty, her ability to seduce, and her capacity to bear children, she used all of these as weapons. She seduced the heir to the throne to return from oblivion. She bore children to strengthen her position at court. And finally, the death of her child, whether real or fabricated, it hardly matters, became the catalyst that transformed her from an object of palace games into a subject. This act, real or attributed to her, was the ultimate, unthinkable sacrifice, demonstrating to her enemies and allies that she was willing to step over the most fundamental law of nature, a mother's love for her child, to achieve her goal. She was, in effect, telling the world, if I am capable of this, imagine what I am capable of doing to you, my enemies. She had to become more cruel, more cunning, and more ruthless than any man, because the path to power for a woman was 1,000 times harder. A man needed only the right of birth for legitimacy. She had to create her legitimacy from blood, fear, and divine prophecies. Her paradox is that in order to rule like a man, she had to simultaneously use and destroy the very essence of womanhood as it was understood in her era. She could not be both a virtuous mother and the son of heaven, and she made her choice. The story of Zetian is not just a thrilling tale from the distant past. It is a timeless and universal meditation on the nature of power, the price of ambition, and how history itself is written. Her life is an extreme example of how a system designed to suppress an individual can create its most ferocious destroyer. The patriarchal world of the Tang Dynasty tried to lock her in a cage, but instead of breaking, she turned that cage into a weapon and tore down the entire aviary. Her story teaches us that power has no gender, but that society has, for millennia, artificially created barriers, and overcoming those barriers requires superhuman effort and, often, monstrous sacrifices. And finally, her blank stele is the greatest lesson for us all. It reminds us that history is not a fixed set of facts, but a continuous dialogue, a narrative that each era writes in its own way. The victors, in her case, the restored Tang Dynasty and the Confucian scholars, wrote their version, creating the image of a monster. But the empty space on her tomb invites us to look deeper, to doubt the official versions, and to try to understand the complex, contradictory, and tragic figure of the woman who dared to sit on the dragon throne. She leaves us with the eternal question: who do we become on the path to power? And is the throne worth the price we must pay for it? The answer is one that each of us must find for ourselves, gazing at that empty, silent stone slab that says more than 1,000 chiseled words.